Yeah, no doubt. Cool. And no, then that reminded me, was part of what you were saying was Zizek puts forth this idea of going from Marx back to Hegel. And I don't know if, I guess that's a, I guess maybe that's a something he gets from Adorno, this idea of reversal. Because I don't know much about Adorno. I've looked at it into his sociology, his commentary on society a little bit, but not quite. I don't know him as a philosopher, honestly. So, but yeah, I'm thrilled to hear more about it. And Zizek, I don't know what book to start reading first. I guess Less Than Nothing is like, that's one of his biggest books. And I guess that'd be a good place to start. I'm not too sure, but I've listened to a lot of his lectures, hours and hours of his lectures, but it's hard to piece together what he thinks completely from his lectures alone. So
Hunter suggested, I only barely got started and didn't get very far. He suggested The Dash as a good place to get started. It's a small book. There's these three.
Don't let that fool you.
Yeah.
It's small, but it's not easy.
There's three Slovenian philosophers, Zizek and then a couple others.
Was it Dolar and Zapanchik, or?
Yeah.
Or maybe not Dolar, maybe I think he's French or something, but Zapanchik for sure.
Oh, right. Oh, so maybe they're not anyway. But I think it is those three. But they are cooperating in this series of books, and The Dash is part of it. But that's what he recommended as a place to start. I don't know about.
Was that his stuff on Hegel? Or?
Yeah. The Dash is
okay on Hegel.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
the beginning of the logic.
What's that?
The dash is right there at the beginning of the logic, right? So
I'm not sure.
Logic, book 1, chapter 1, right? Well, right. So book 1, doctrine of being, chapter 1, right? Being.
Oh.
Being,
okay.
Dash. In its pure, indeterminate, in its pure indeterminacy, right? Instead of saying being is, okay? Because is the verb form of being, right? So he avoided the problem of being is by being dash in its pure, in its pure indeterminacy proves to be nothing. Which, okay, so I don't know, for what it's worth, I can throw this out there. I was thinking about that issue earlier today, or not earlier this week. How he looks at being and sees in its pure indeterminacy nothing. And I was thinking you might as well look at being, capital B, in its pure indeterminacy and see all that is, right? Which is the opposite of nothing, which led me to believe actually that's kind of what he does through the rest of the science of logic. He unpacks being into becoming to then unfold logically to encompass all that is, right? And then I agree with the characterization of a Mobius strip, right? We have becoming, which is a dynamic interplay of being and nothing in their vanishingness, right? And then through the other side of becoming, you go through all that is until you wind up with being, which in its pure indeterminacy means nothing, which, you know what I mean? I think there is a cycle, right? Where, but we have two different kind of approaches into that dialectic between being and nothing, right? Like out of it, you go through everything, all that is, and then wind up back where being is, which is not, anyway, just a thought that I had. I don't know what it's worth in the bigger field of Hegel's scholarship, but it was a bit of a schema that helped me kind of understand. Maybe think of the logic itself as a big Mobius strip.
Dylan, just FYI, I probably understand Hegel less than you do, is my guess. So if you're worried about, like I figure maybe I've understood 20% of this book, maybe, and I have this sort of sinking feeling that when we finish this book in October, I will not know a great deal more about Hegel than I did going in, just because I understand so little. So don't feel bad about that.
Oh no, it started a fever in me. I'm not gonna lie. I don't like not knowing, so it propels me forward. So I've been studying pretty frantically. I've missed the last couple of of these meetings, right? But it's not because it's mainly been I was on vacation one week and then had to get my work schedule ironed out. I was working, but nonetheless, every night I sit down and I do something for at least probably about 2 to 3 hours a day, and this progress is still slow. The progress is still slow, but yeah, no doubt. I've thought about asking anybody in the group if they had any other time during the week. I would love to get with somebody over Zoom or something like that and just go over the stuff that I'm trying to put Hegel together in general, and German idealism in general. Because I looked there for a couple of weeks at Kant alone, and I got his critique of pure reason on my Kindle, I believe, and then I was trying to piece my way through Kant, at least conceptually, from just a bit, so I can kind of understand Hegel's responses and reactions to somebody like Kant. But then I'm sure he has the same amount, same level of responses and reactions to somebody like Schelling and Fichte. And so it's good. It looks like I can tell it's a long road to travel here, but I've started along it, and I'm pretty determined to get somewhere. Now I may veer off, of course, and like you're saying, get through Phenomenology of Spirit and maybe know 10-15% of it, just roughly, but nonetheless, I'm extremely excited about it, and I love to come hear y'all guys talk on it, because in general, it seems like y'all are more versed in Western philosophy and German idealism. Eric seems like he could talk for a while on it, which is awesome. I love to hear it. But yeah, no doubt. So I'm trying to make some progress. Hopefully by the end of the seminar, I could be able to give more input and stuff like that. But I appreciate that. Yeah, no doubt.
If you want, one of the books Joey and I have been reading that I find really helpful, because he breaks down each section of the Phenomenology and tries to present the argument of the text as is this one. It's The Logic of Desire. And I put it in the chapter, and he'll give he basically gives each section that we're reading and breaks his chapter up into what those sections are. And it's funny because some of it I have to keep rereading, but he has this little section in here. I don't know if you can see it, but it says, "We are here," in the Phenomenology. It was like looking at like a labyrinth. I was like, oh, thanks, David Bowie. It's good to know that.
No doubt.
But it's a real good one. I like that. And for me, I had to put Zizek down and read Kalkovich only with Hegel.
Right.
To help me at least get a classical understanding, because on my own I wasn't grasping it at all.
Sure.
And I think I'll do more Zizek. Man, I hope I don't. Hunter may felt a disturbance in the force. I'll do more Zizek after Kalkovich, I think, and then that at least that helps me.
Yeah, and then
I put the dash in there too.
The dash. Okay, awesome. I'll copy both of those down too, and then I've been doing a lot of my research on Hegel from Marxist.org, right? And so I don't know. It seems like a decent source, but then of course it's going to have this leftist swing to it, just from being Marxist.org. So, but I don't know. They have a huge array of hyperlinks of different analytics on Hegel, analysis on Hegel, criticisms on Hegel. It's got Marx on Hegel, Engels on Hegel. It's got actually a lot of information on here. But I've been going back and forth between that and, of course, like the Stanford Encyclopedia and all this other kind of stuff. But I'm trying to copy down every source that I can for understanding this madman,
You made some comment about earlier, like which is the real Hegel. I don't think there's an answer to that, because at least not. So I mean, within the decade after Hegel, you had left and right Hegelians, and then it just continued to fragment after that. And so I think the best Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but the best you can say is that there are different schools of interpretation that are arguing with each other in the literature all the time. And there may be some interpretations that the consensus is that they're just not justifiable from the text anymore. But there are just, there are I don't know how many, there are several major streams of interpretations that have significant tensions with one another. And I don't think there's any, there's no Hegel God, or there's no single authority that anybody has ceded to that says, well, this guy gets to define that. So that's part of the problem with a lot of philosophers, but especially with ones like Hegel, is that, part of the difficult, and this is, part of the difficulty is just figuring out when you're reading a secondary source, trying to figure out which stream this guy belongs to. Because, like Joseph was saying, if you read one secondary source that's from, this sort of Zizek school of interpretation, you read another one that's closer to a more traditional interpretation, you'll get significant differences. And if you ask the question, which one's right? Well, if you ask these guys, they'll say them. And if you ask those guys, they'll say them. And, me is not, knowing very little about Hegel, all I can say is there's these different schools, and that's kind of the end of it. I think it is important, though, to try to get a sense of which one of these streams you're looking at when you are reading secondary sources, because like Eric was saying, Adorno and that kind of Frankfurt School thing will have one way of reading him, and this other school have another way of reading him. But I don't think there's any one right interpretation.
Adorno even says there are two Hegels, right? Well, this is Adorno's charge, right? His interpretation that there are moments in Hegel where he stays very close to the object, and he really, is a good model of immanent critique, and this is where we find moments that can be utilized by materialists. And then there's the other Hegel, which is just, is caught up in the lofty concept, and has to bring everything to fit within the system, which ultimately reconciles all being and thought into a speculative unity. And he said, that's the Hegel that was the product of his bourgeois time, just the exuberance of the ushering modernity and the excitement of the revolution and all that had taken place. So he was caught up in that kind of, optimistic, this is the march of freedom unfolding, and we have this underlying speculative unity between thought and being. We just, haven't really quite grasped it as such until now, but that's the very speculative and one, the Hegel that the orbit is the idea, whereas there's another Hegel where the orbit is the object, and those are anyway, the moments where Adorno prizes Hegel the most, when he's most faithful to the object.
Yeah, no doubt. And then, of course, like to me, reading through Hegel, it seems hard for me to grasp him as a materialist, especially because like I've seen some people label him belonging to the school of phenomenology, and then other ones say no, he's an idealist, and then some say, of course, no, he's a materialist. But it was interesting. One thing I came across was that I think somewhere I read that the original title for the Phenomenology of Spirit, he had put forth the at least at one point was to be called the science of the experience of consciousness. And so that if that holds any weight as a indication towards the text itself, that kind of helps me in and of itself understand at least the angle from which, I mean, if that's the correct angle, of course, angle at which what he's trying to do, like a goal of the text itself. And so it does seem that he's like, because I look at his logic and even his dialectical movement, and it seems, honestly, Hegel's logic seems pretty stout to me, pretty undeniable in a couple of ways. It seems like, okay, like the way that we deal with the world of appearances, and then we through being, and then we reflect on those appearances, trying to get to the essence of the concept, the essence of the object itself, and then moving, and then of course he has that whole possible form, right, of the thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And there's like, I see all these triadic forms of Hegel's logic and all these different things, and it's a bit of a mess for me right now, but I can see this, maybe this formation of this dialectical movement, and it seems really interesting to me. And furthermore, it seems, at least the way in which I'm grasping it, as a pretty sound logic in a lot of ways, at least dealing with perception and then moving on to reflection and all the rest, getting to that essence. But then again, don't know enough quite yet to actually say, okay, well, I think he's saying this. If I ever will get to that point, not sure, but it's extremely enjoyable to try.
You're doing better than I am at following, because I kind of have a sense for the general movement of the book, but as far as like trying to follow the argument, I just can't. I mean, there's, that I get completely lost in the details, and I can see where some of the dialectic is doing things, but then other places, it seems to me he just says this is the way it is, and I don't see any argument. I don't see how it connects to the rest of what he's doing. So, and maybe I'm just not getting it, but to be honest, I've got to the point where we are in the book now to where I'm just reading it like, okay, Hegel says this, and then Hegel says that, and then Hegel says this, and I can, understand a fair amount of what he says. I just don't understand the argument that supports it. I just see Hegel saying this is what society is about. Hegel saying this is what guilt is. This is what fate is. And I'm like, okay, Hegel, if I accept that, then I can evaluate what you say here about it. But I really don't know where you got that from. I don't see how this follows from what you said before, and I don't see how that follows from what you said before. And so that's my experiences, and maybe it's because I haven't been reading enough of these secondary sources or whatever, or I haven't read the logic, but he says interesting things, but like there's things that he said in these last two sections that have to do with relationships between people and the structure of society, some of which sound very, I don't know, reactionary or something, and a little terrifying. And I'm like, well, Nietzsche says terrifying and reactionary things, but I understand why he says them. And so I can go back and look at his argument and say, well, here's why I disagree with your conclusion, because I don't think what you say here follows from what you said before. In the case of Hegel, I don't understand how it's supposed to follow. And so it's hard for me to see why he's saying the things he's saying a lot of the time. And maybe it's just, the first time I read Aristotle, I described it as backing up, ramming my head into the wall, backing up and doing that over and over again. And maybe that's what I'm experiencing with Hegel here, is a similar kind of, the first time I'm reading something. But so I don't know, but I just don't, I am not experiencing this as a convincing dialectical argument as you seem to be. I'm experiencing it as, I kind of get a vague sense of these dialectical movements moving through here and there, but I don't really understand the necessity that he sees in it. And then there's other stuff he says that I don't see how it's connected at all to what he's saying. So just by the way, as a side thing, I posted this link to an Amazon thing, Kant's Theory of Knowledge. That's a little book that is the best dense summary, a clear summary I've seen of, I'm calling it Kant's metaphysics, though, some people say he doesn't have metaphysics. But anyway, it's the noumena and the phenomena and the different deductions and that sort of thing. So if you want a nice introduction to Kant without having to actually try to wade through the critique of pure knowing or a critique of pure reason, then that's a good resource.
Okay, yeah, no doubt. I'll definitely take that up. But to understand Hegel at all, you're right. Secondary source is the only thing that's helping me grasp anything. But
I had the thought yesterday, right, that in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant lays out these there's antinomies of thought, and then there's another section which are the paralogisms, right? Which, I'm not a Kant scholar, so I can't really nail it, what's the difference between the antinomies and the paralogisms. I'm sure there's a good answer though. But these points where we kind of reach an aporia and we can't, it's because we try to extend thought beyond experience, that thought leads us into these inevitable contradictions. Like, is space an infinite continuous thing, or is it a discrete, is it, can we do that, all the way to the minuscule, or is it a discrete thing? Is it relational or absolute? Actually, that's how he phrases it, right? Is it relation? Because that's what Leibniz kind of characterized space as, this relational thing, it only makes sense in terms of relations between, but then Newtonian physics only makes sense in terms of an absolute space. And so he put anyway, So I'm belaboring that point way too much. My point being, I had the thought about how Hegel in many respects is responding to Kant. So I think in part, he looks at the antinomies and the paralogisms where Kant says, okay, these are things that thought cannot reconcile because it has divorced itself from experience. And Hegel says, hold my beer.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. You know, the few commentaries I've read have said that, I mean, this is just a summary of what you said, is that Kant says the aspect of reason that can grasp experience is the understanding, which is what grasps the, you know, phenomenal, like you said, phenomenal experience. And then when reason tries to move past that, it gets out of its domain and comes up with all these contradictions. And then I've heard, you know, some of the commentators that said, well, Hegel's saying, exactly like you said, hold my beer, that no, you can use reason to extend beyond understanding. And these apparent contradictions are just not insoluble. They're just an indication of how you have to apply reason dialectically once you move past the domain of experience. So yeah, that seems consistent. And so I understand, you know, sort of general principles. It's just when you get down into the, you know, the muck of the phenomenology, I get lost. It's like, you know, it's like flying over the swamp and then someone drops you in it and you're like, oh God, I have no idea where I am. I'm just sinking and I'm drowning now. And I'm not in the plane anymore.
Yeah. Kalkovich calls it a labyrinth and a gauntlet. And Camus actually calls the phenomenology a crucible. So I was like, that's pretty good. Please forgive me. I have to go get my son because they're having transportation issues. So I'm going to be about 15-20 minutes, but I'll be right back.
I just posted in the chat there. It's a couple of different diagrams of people trying to kind of map out his dialectical movement, and it's kind of, the diagrams itself are kind of hard to work through, but honestly the visual aspect kind of helps me to at least grasp this interpretation of Hegel to a degree. But yeah, no, it's they're just saying that's there too, because sometimes it helps me just see something. But yeah, his doctrine of essence in the logic, because I think he wrote the logic after the phenomenology, and I think maybe going to read the logic is helping me to grasp, at least I think, this is all speculative in my opinion. I don't know how well I'm grasping it honestly, but it seems to be helping me to understand a little bit of his movement, dialectical movement in the phenomenology itself. But I've just been trying to find really good secondary sources to help me here because of just my lack of knowledge of idealism in general. But slowly trekking.
Yeah, to be honest, I do feel like his writing style improved between writing the phenomenology and writing the logic, and his
Yes.
tracing of these dialectical movements into speculative unity is a little bit more clear and easy to follow than in the phenomenology. I feel like he sees it and he just kind of throws it, you know, and you're supposed to have seen what he's seeing, you know, but he didn't really quite spell it and flesh it out. Whereas if you go to logic, he's a little bit more explicit about what these the various forms of how dialectical thinking can lead to speculative unity, and it just takes different forms, right? You know, but so there's not one map of how to move from a dialectical opposition to a speculative unity. It's always dependent on what you know, imminent, right? What is imminent to what's being investigated. But there are a few like patterns or forms, right? Where they, you know, certain speculative unities kind of resemble other, you know, speculative unities. It's not a coexistence. It's actually it's a one with the other, you know, but there are other ones where there seems to be coexistence, you know, so it's just different, I don't know, different ways to characterize the end result of a speculative unity.
No doubt.
Hunter, were you gonna, I'm sorry.
Go
I
ahead,
thought Hunter had unmuted himself a minute ago and then.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hey.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, that's awesome, dude. That's so crazy.
So Hunter is Zizek and Eric is Adorno. So
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, it's just the big problem with Adorno just keeps it's that and Zizek's big argument, and it's one that I don't know. I'm not Dr. Manhattan. I don't know everything, but I've been compelled by arguments that I could follow in books by Zizek, where he's saying like the problem is Adorno's conception of reconciliation, which is why there's that dual aspect of like sometimes he's good, sometimes she sucks, and he totally loses the plot, and he loses the. I'm not saying this is what you're saying. I'm being hyperbolic. By the way, let me just preface all this. By the way, Wednesday of last week, I went to New Braunfels and spent 6 hours at a Schlitterbahn. Then I went home, and then I spent a day inside, and then on Friday, I drove with Travis to New Mexico, then came back on Sunday. And then Monday evening, I left on a plane to California and got back at 5 p.m. exactly. I'm also very sick right now. My head hurts, my stomach hurts. I've been farting a lot. My throat is scratchy. I'm coughing. My nose is running. I've got a box of tissues and some tortilla chips and canned soup, and I'm hot and cold at the same time. I'm just crabby, is all I'm saying. I'm crabby. I'm grumpy. I'm fussy. I'm real fussy right now. And I'm trying my damnedest because I didn't think I would be here. And here I am. And so you
Thank
better
you,
be
Hunter.
thankful for my
I mean, sincerely, thank you for
oh no, whatever.
trying to be here.
I just all my now any heinous thing I say, any totally disagreeable thing that I might say, you should be thankful that I said it rather than critique me, because I'm sick and I deserve sympathy rather than critique. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Let me get to my point rather than my personal hour. My point is, just on one hand, I have like a couple things I want to talk about. First, I think that Zizek's argument about Adorno is that there's this problem with reconciliation where, or this problem with, it's a twofold problem. And he says there is criticism worthy, or Hegel is worthy of criticism in this regard, but so is Adorno, is kind of Zizek's point. He says like, Hegel is writing in an ambiguous dual speak way often. And he is admitting, he's like, this is one of the possible and probably coexistent readings of the different minutiae within his texts, where he'll write a sentence and mean something in two different ways. The meat of the matter, the heart of the issue is reconciliation. It's reconciliation with antagonisms. What does that mean? When we say Hegel, that fucking guy on the front of this book, say reconciliation with antagonisms, does that mean reconciliation with antagonisms such that those antagonisms are reconciled and thus resolved, so that the antagonisms themselves are thus reconciled? Or as another totally plausible meaning. And you know what, Nevin, I was reading this section. Maybe it was because I was so sick, but the last couple pages, I was like, I get it. Dude, I was getting so frustrated again with him. And at least it's kind of like I just get, I don't get like totally despondent or like, I feel totally worthless or anything at any point. It's just, I'm pissed at him, because I know he could do it differently. I know he could say it a little differently, but maybe he can't. Whatever. The point is, reconciliation with antagonisms can also imply the reading that Zizek gives him, which is not the other reconciliation, which is the reconciliation of the antagonisms with me and in a cohesive unity of identity, but reconciliation with antagonisms still present at the end of the reconciliation. The reconciliation occurs and the antagonisms are still there. Reconciliation with antagonisms. Well, it's like, literally, I'm just inflecting a little differently. And it's like the meaning can really change. It's like, And so Zizek is saying, like, I think that there's a severe ambiguity that marks like all of Hegel's writing, partly intentionally, or pretty much entirely intentionally is his reading. He says it's pretty much entirely intentional. There are certain parts where it could be clearer potentially, but there's no way of knowing. It's just up to us, you know, which is also kind of part of what Hegel's saying. And he's like, I just want to give credit where credit's due, that like, you know, it's not impossible to take this reading of Hegel's dialectic as being reconciliation with antagonisms rather than reconciliation. I'll change the phrasing just for the sake of convenience, of antagonism. And Zizek is saying, I think that Adorno reads that phrase as reconciliation of antagonisms into this speculative unity, which, you know, would resemble something like what Hegel would call the simple universal, or the simple soul, or the simple unity, you know, the absolute simple unity, which he constantly is like, don't do that. He's like, every other page, he's like, do not unify things in a blanket monological way. Do not look at the entire universe as a cohesive, singularly structured glass sphere of reason. Do not look at reality as not containing immanent antagonisms that need to be reconciled with to the end. Don't ever think that you're done. You know, he's saying, like, and that's part of my thing is like, and this is my second thought, is I'm sad to hear that it's giving you so much guff, Nevitt, but at the same time, I'm kind of with you. And I guess, I mean, a part of it is that I have, since I was like 17, I've been interested in secondary sources of Hegel. So it's clear, like, I obviously will have a little bit more like ease sliding into the primary source, like, definitely. And there will be a little bit of a bent to it, or like a, you know what I mean? They're like, my secondary sources will color my reading of Hegel for sure. But it also makes it glide a little easier, which is a bad thing and a good thing. But I'm just saying, like, that's my experience. And even from this position, there are a lot of moments where he's talking about something and I'm like he'll get into the absolute essence of the Lord of the world is a mad, vacuous tyrant. And I'm like, is that, she serious? Whoa, what? Yeah, I'm like, we're talking like crazy kings and stuff now. We were just talking about like formal logic like a page ago, like one page. He was talking about really hardcore formal logic that I could barely keep pace with. And then he's like, and fucking women are like this. And I'm like, oh my God. So sometimes I miss when he switches, when he diverts and goes to a new line of thinking. I get lost a lot. But then it's just about, for me at least, I read the paragraph. I do it paragraph by paragraph too. I try to do like, here's the paragraph. Okay, what's the point? You know what I mean? What are some of the, which I guess is how you read anything in a way. That's how I read pretty much anything. But like, I try to write a few things, like what are bullet points from this paragraph? What are like 2 or 3 basic points for this paragraph? And then what secondary source stuff that I'm bringing in, what does that remind me of? And I'll write that in a different like ink color. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. But like, I really am trying to keep myself afloat and not keep a nice solid line between my baggage, my personal leanings and readings, and the readings of my idols and heroes, versus like what I actually think he's saying. Because I really do think there are splits, and I really do think that Hegel is he's like one of those, you ever seen like the eels that Japanese people cook? They're the slippery black, like inky eels that you got to grab with both hands. And they're in the circular bucket because otherwise they'll just slip out of your hands constantly. Every time you try to squish them, they're just like made up almost of liquid. That's how I think of Hegel. It's just he's and he enjoys it almost, I think. I think he takes a little bit of pride. I think it's part of his mission. I think he feels that it's important to his work. I don't know if that's the case, but I think that he felt like he was really onto something. And then other people have thought that. But I guess just to stop talking, is I read through this section and I got like the majority of it from from the beginning. I was just like, well, actually, from the beginning, the first part, self-consciousness still hasn't risen to singular individuality. That was like the first line, and I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? What are you talking about? Self-consciousness hasn't risen? I thought it would fall. What's rising to what? Singular individuality. But I was like, okay, maybe I'll understand that later. And so I just wrote it down, and then I kept going, and I found the meat and potatoes of that section or that paragraph to be like the role of doing and deeds and decisions in consciousness. I thought that was very understandable and reasonable. And there are other parts like this notion self-consciousness still hasn't risen to singular individuality. Things like that I'm like, I don't really know what you're talking about, but I am going to keep it in mind as I continue. And a lot of the time, he'll give it to you later. He'll be like each section when it has like a letter and then like the legality of state or the state of legalism or whatever the hell. It's like the first paragraph is a brief summary of what's to come. And you don't know that because he's just speaking a bunch of gibberish until you finish the chapter and you're like, oh my God, he told me all this was going to happen at the start. Holy crap. And I don't really know what the implications are of all this, but it does follow what he said it would do, you know? And I guess I see him as the way Nevitt, I think my real thought as why I think that he is still followable to me, even though I also have this problem of like knowing every step of the logical movement, is that at the beginnings of sections that we read, he will start it off with like a basic statement, like just recently, he opened up and was like, okay, reason is a part of spirit. We know this vocab term. Spirit becomes certain of itself as all reality. That's reason. That's what we could call that. And then even if he's making it up, even if he's just kind of, beguiling me, there is like a consistency to it. And I want to see where it's going. And I'm like, okay, let's just call that reason. Let's file that under the category reason and then keep going and then see how it kind of unfolds and fits together. It's like solving a maze, but you can only see like a little pinhole. There's like a huge maze on a piece of paper in front of me, and I can only see a little pinhole of light through, and I have to trace the line, and then every once in a while I'll get lost, and I'll be looking around, and I'm like, where the fuck was I? What was going on? And then I'll see parts of it that look right later on that I'm not there yet. And I'm like, oh God, okay, I got to fill that in. Oh, okay. And then as it progresses, those two lines connected. Oh, yes, I feel like a chimp that discovered fire or something. I'm like, yes, that actually, like seriously, when I am reading him and he says something that's like, blah, 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 blah is the case. And then I'm like, is that really the case? Let's see. And then 50 pages later or something, he's describing this other situation where I'm like, based on what you said however long ago, it should be this, right? Or at least I'm feeling that. Maybe I'm not directly consciously thinking that line of thinking, but I'm feeling that. Like, I feel like I remember this rule. This is from earlier, yeah. And sometimes, very rarely now, which is a good sign, he will be like, nope, reversal, sorry, what I told you a little bit ago, I lied, I don't know, sorry, or I was speaking from the perspective of a dumb guy or something. But then sometimes it really does like follow the rule that I expected. And that is like, I feel like Eve biting into the apple. I feel so like I've unearthed some Egyptian riddle or something. I feel so powerful when that happens. And I don't know. I none of that is supposed to help at all. That's just my experience. And I really relate to what you're saying, and I struggle with it. And this guy pisses me off, but in sort of a lovable way, in like you scamp, back at your intense grammatical, I would say your ixionic wheel of grammatical torture that you've placed me into. Sorry. Anyway, that's it.
Well, that's helpful, to sort of give me an overview of the way you approach the text. So, thank you for kind of outlining that. So I do find that helpful. What I'm tempted to do is just ask some, I have some specific questions in this section, since I don't understand. I mean, I think I understand some of the general ideas, like there's this tension between these different kinds of laws and, the divine, and which I'm glad that, Chase and whoever, Travis, had us read Antigone, because you really do see Antigone all over the last section and all over this section when he's talking about he doesn't even bother to tell you. He starts talking about the brother and the sister and the divine law versus the civil law, and he doesn't even bother to tell you. I mean, I think Antigone, the word Antigone appears once, I think, in this entire section, and yet, Antigone is just all over the place here. And so I'm glad that Chase and Travis had the foresight to have us do that. A couple of things, if you guys want to talk about more meaty things, that's fine. These are just a couple of things. One of the things I'm struggling with both in the last section and this section is he sometimes talks about singular, I don't even know if there's a question here, but he sometimes talks about singular individuality. And the first time I heard him say that, I assumed he was talking about like literally this individual. But then he distinguishes singular individuality from some other term, I can't remember what he uses, which I take to mean the literally the particular person. And so when he says singular individuality, because he says literally in some places, I haven't been able to put my finger on it, but he says, when I'm talking about singular individuality, I'm talking about individuality as universal, which sounds contradictory, but I think I understand what he's saying. He's talking about things that apply to the category of individual. And actually, I'm not sure if this is right. That I finally got this little light bulb going on in my mind about this, the relationship between the universal and the singular, or the particular, and the reason it's not as straightforward is because when I think I know that for you guys this is probably old hat. For me, it was a little light bulb. It was like, well, when I say if singular individual is universal, what that means is when I think singular individual, I am thinking in terms of a category that is the category of singular individual, which is the features that all singular individuals have in common, which is still a universal. So the idea singular individual is still a universal. And so that was sort of slightly revelatory for me, but it's confused. I'm just saying this one of the things that's confusing to me is he's here in these last two sections, he's talking about the role of the singular individual vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis the family. And I'm having a hard time figuring out when he's talking about, as a sort of type, categorical thing. These are like features of human social life, or whether sometimes he does seem to be talking about, no, this particular individual, which is almost reminds me of this of sense certainty. This individual is not anything you can really say anything about, because you can only say things about universals. And so that's one thing I find confusing, because I think occasionally he is talking about the concrete, real, like, and I think specifically when you're dead, when you're dead, you become this absolute concrete individual thing, but you've somehow at that point sort of escaped the universal and become this concrete particular. But I'm having a hard time keeping track of those two different uses of the word individual and how they relate to what he's saying. And another thing is, he all of a sudden the word divine pops up in here, and I don't remember, maybe it was in the last section, but I don't remember him saying much about divine. And all of a sudden divine shows up, and he's talking about specifically the divine law, as opposed to, I've forgotten what the other one was, but like basically civil law or positive law. And where did this come from? Where did this divine come from? It's just all of a sudden he starts talking about divine. And maybe, if you go look at secondary sources, he will say, they'll say things like, well, this is basically, he's at some places, he's importing the Trinity into his thinking, but he hasn't said anything like that here. And so I'm wondering what does divine, yeah, there you go, human law versus this divine law, and which I assume you also see at play in Antigone. So again, I'm glad that we read Antigone, because you see this, Antigone talking about this divine law. So anyway, those are a couple of things I've been struggling with is, does the concrete particular individual have any relevance in these two sections, or is it all universal? The individual is universal, and then what is this divine law? How did the divine get into here?
So I think what Hunter brought up earlier in terms of that early phrase in this section on spirit that through him, that spirit hasn't yet risen to the level of what is it, the individual particular? Is that the word, that the phrasing he uses, that through you? Okay, so I think it's helpful. I think there are a couple clues as well, like in the we've read today, or in our reading that we're discussing today, that indicate that we're kind of recapitulating. And I think you expressed an intuition of this, recapitulating an early the dialectical movement that started off this book, the sense certainty and the thisness of things. And so I think he's kind of going back almost to ground zero, starting with the ethical life, right? Only the thing is, with starting with sense certainty, we start with like, an individual consciousness, a universal individual consciousness, but then we kind of build from that individual consciousness, and we introduce another consciousness. We have master-slave dialectic now. And so he starts with kind of an individual universal consciousness and builds out until we get to a community. But now that we have a community, we have a question about ethical life. I think he takes it back to early, ancient classical history. And if we're going to look at ethical life in that world, then there really are no, like, the onus, the focus of ethical obligations isn't the individual as we think of him today in the modern world. The individual subject with his, different, it's more like, insofar as Antigone had a duty to bury her brother, it was because of her membership to a family, but also her membership to a larger group that dictated what was. And then Hegel's looking at just diagnosing it, like, historically in this ancient world, we had two competing sources of normativity, if you like, right? We had the natural order, which was understood in a mystified way with gods, right? And then we had the purely, human order. Like, there's no way that you can, it seemed obvious, I guess, to the Greeks at the time, and to us now, that, obeying the laws of the king is not the same as obeying the laws of gravity, but obviously the Greeks wouldn't have thought of it as obeying the laws of gravity, but more along, the laws of the natural order, as, the gods have created this world and, imbued it with its patterns. And when we bury the dead, it is because that is, in harmony with what the world as created by the gods, that demands respect for the dead, right? So anyway, Antigone's ethical obligations aren't bearing on her by virtue of her individual particularity, the things that make Antigone a unique human being with no identical other human being like her, right? So that is irrelevant here, right? However, these kinds of things do feature when we start talking about morality in the modern world, and how we treat people as, in their diversity and multiple, in the pluralism, of individuals, with their unique qualities, right? So I'm seeing this as going back to a beginning or early stage to talk about an ethical life. And so we really focus more on collectives or members of, memberships to a group, whether it's a human group, if you're a member of the army, then you have to obviously follow the laws of the general, but there are also other laws that we follow, those belonging to the natural order as we understand them, in their mystified forms or another. So I'm thinking that he kind of, again, takes the ethical life, goes back to an early form of this dialectic, and noting early on that this ethical life doesn't quite admit of individual unique human beings. Antigone, as somebody never to be repeated. I think Antigone, as we understand Antigone, is a figure to be repeated. But like I said, more importantly, her ethical obligations are a function of her membership to a group, and that ethical obligations as a function of being an individual and to others as them being unique individuals is something that will come up later. And then I was going to throw this out. So as a matter, clues to make me think that we're starting to recapitulate something of a dialectic, that brings us back to, along a similar path that we've been through before, only bearing in mind the ethical life as opposed to a single consciousness, is when he revisits the form of skepticism, and then later the form of the unhappy consciousness, and then how this leads us to the next stage, right? So I think, in similar ways, the dialectic of ethical life will take us to a stage that in many ways resembles the skeptic, in his own withdrawing from the world, right? And sense of self as being radically separate from the world. And then from that to an unhappy consciousness, which is, the world is evil, and, I'm good, and there's no way that I can reconcile myself to the world, I think that's kind of what he's revisiting there, looking at ancient ethical life, and then we're about to transition into something else, I think.
So question I asked, which Hunter gave me an answer I would like to understand better. From what you were saying, I thought maybe when Hegel's using the word divine, he wasn't using it to describe something about his own value, his own view, but he was using it to describe basically Antigone's situation, so like in the classical Greek world, these were the tensions between the divine law and the human law. But then Hunter, in your response, you said, I think divine law is a term that he uses to describe one half of this part of the dual-sided problem of ethics, I guess, versus logic. So are you saying that these terms, singular, divine, family, and so on, are aspects of ethics as opposed to logic?
No, sorry, hold on, wait, oh God, can you hear me? What the fuck? My shit is all fucked up.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good.
You're being negated.
I'm sorry. Thank God somebody's going to come and do it. Then I can return to generic universality as a pure particular. Thank God. Thank God. I'm sorry. I'm also sucking on a cough drop. But my point is, to me, my whole point. I meant ethics, like ethics / logic, like ethics and logic. But so here's my basic point. I just think there's a section that he had. It's before page 277. I don't know where. Let me just see. I'm going to find the exact thing. I'm not going to read directly from it, but let's see. This is the part where he's talking about like the feminine and shit. And I think he says some really cool stuff. But let's see. The piety, so what would it be? Youth. Yes, yes. So that would be page 274, sections 472 and 473. He says the basic points that I get from that section, this is why I think it's relevant. He says youth escapes nature. He says youth escapes nature. And nature for him is like the family. Nature, this is totally in line with everything Eric said, I think. Because Eric was like, the natural laws of the divine, you know, and he's very imminently connecting divinity and family and singularity and nature. Is like the laws of gravity. It's the way that the gods set it up. Youth tries to escape, or does escape in a way, from nature, i.e. family, i.e. divinity. You know, he escapes from this imminent connection to it for the sake of individuality in the polity, or of the polity. But nature, this is the point I think of this section, is that nature, in a way, recomplicates things for the youth. This is, I guess, his explanation. Here's why youth is not an infinite story of success and freedom for everybody. It's more complicated than that, because nature is wild and it's particular and it's singular and it can do wild stuff, like retaliating against the youth's attempt to escape it by giving equal right to freedom and self-consciousness and individuality and all that to two brothers. He said earlier, the brother and the sister. I know there were parts of it that sounded weird, but I really thought it was sweet. I thought it was very, very sweet. I don't know. It just seemed like such a nice thing. If I were his sister and I read that, oh, I'd be over the moon. My point is, excuse that. So you take two brothers who have equal right to freedom and to doing and to the expression of their thought as actuality, the exercise of the actualization of purpose as the purpose of action. That was such a crazy part when he said that. The purpose of action is the actualization of purpose. I was like, okay, So he says both have equal right to do that. And I don't think he's saying this is how it always is every time with two brothers. But we posit a situation where one fights with the people, the polity, i.e. for Creon, basically. The other fights against it. And that's Polynices, whatever. So the one that fights with the polity, that's a weird term I'd never heard before this book, by the way. The people, I guess. One that fights with the people is seen as right. He's attacking a singular individual, this one guy who's fucking with us. Meanwhile, that guy down there that's fucking with us that we're trying to attack, he's not just attacking people, he's attacking the essence of human rights. He's attacking, and this is a popular line used in the United States. It's a threat to freedom. It's a threat to democracy. It's a threat to the global order. We are the peacekeepers. We're not just arbiters of our personal national will. Yes, we keep justice afloat. So okay. And that's what I think Creon's point is like, we're fucking awesome. And this guy, Polynices, he's just trying to be a barbarian. Who would want that? We're trying to be ethical. He's just trying to kill. And so you have a battle of universal and singular. So in this battle of two theoretical brothers, you have universal and singular, i.e. the human and the divine, which is at the same time the polity and the family. So it's the polity and the family, the human and the divine, the universal and the singular, and then he makes the next move. This is where Hegel gets weird. And he says, this is the same problem as the split between consciousness and unconsciousness. And his definition of unconsciousness is weird, and I do not understand it, so don't push me too hard. But he says, we might think that this other guy is so evil and terrible and dark and whatever, but the unconscious is an essential power in the logic of maintaining a conscious. If we're going to maintain the notion of light, we have to maintain a notion of dark. Unconsciousness is the law of weakness and darkness and the netherworld and the divine and the singular and the flawed and it's like Dostoevsky, where he said the humiliated and the insulted. To me, I guess it's just this place where logic wants to place or wants to position the things outside of itself, these things that are weak and dark and in the netherworld and unconscious, and this weird divine BS you're trying to sell me. I'm trying to run a state, you know? So the point is, I think, that I see divine law as just this expression of a logical coupling of consciousness and unconsciousness, or light and dark in this way. But daylight, the daylight of consciousness and the darkness of the netherworld, but particularly so in the space of ethics, where it's like, okay, so we know there's this kind of weird interdependency of opposite extremes. We've experienced the coincidence of opposites a few times. We can see that opposites tend to coincide. Well, where do they coincide in ethics? Oh, it's in human and divine law, where, you know, which I guess the opposite of ethics would be barbarism, or just, you know, like total war, which I do think he does argue is like a problem here, is like, yeah, they are coinciding. Your attempt to be like this justiciar, this inquisitor for the sake of the essence of human rights, turns you into this player in this game where the duality is not human and divine in this contest of, like, you know, one necessarily winning out over the other right away, at least not yet. I don't know yet. I know that he tends to work with asymmetry, and so I'm looking for that as I'm reading, but I don't know quite where to point yet for that. My point is, he says okay, so like he talks about the feminine logic, the feminine, and then this is just, you know, it seems kind of weird, but I had to go through some secondary sources to get into his notion of femininity and masculinity, and it helped a lot. But my point is, he says the feminine ridicules wisdom. It ridicules typical wisdom, which is like, this is Zizek. Zizek says, oh, it's wise guys. You know, you got your wise guy. Your guy who's all sitting up on a hill and bestowing little nuggets of golden, you know, ideas that people will go and disperse amongst themselves because it works, because it's a good picture, it works, and it doesn't cause too much of a fuss, and it's not too hard. and Zizek would say that his position is feminine, and he would also say that Hegel is taking up a position that is feminine. But I can't really fight for that right now. But I'm just saying that's what Zizek is saying. So he says the feminine ridicules wisdom and elevates the spirit of familial individuality. The spirit of familial individuality, the spirit of darkness and divinity and natural individual singularity and the right of a human being as a human being. And it still the problem is that it still needs the polity to recognize it. Like saints and priests. Saints, priests, and members of the clergy see themselves as connecting to an order that is far above and beyond the earthly order of the state they live in. Like, if I am a Christian mystic that lives in Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma police come to my door and tell me that I need to pay my taxes or whatever, and I'll tell them, I'm not beholden to you. You are but earthlings. I defer only to one law, and that's a higher law than you could ever know, a divine law. But for that to function at all, for that to exist, for that to literally just exist at all, the polity has to make some basic minimal gesture of like, okay, I recognize it. I'm not going to come in and destroy it, I guess. Because when it doesn't recognize it, it falls apart. The divine law is relegated to the position of like naivete. Like, we look at it like naivete. You know what I mean? It's like how white Westerners in the first world will often look at indigenous communities as these arbiters of this divine, kitschy, naive, like, oh, that's so fun. They have their funny dresses and their dances and their spicy food. Oh, that's lovely. Let's take a, it's like this. If the polity doesn't recognize that divine law, then it doesn't hold water as divine law. It's just a kitsch. It's just a gimmick. It's just a place to sell little pig statues by the road for a couple dollars.
You're losing me, because after a while, I don't understand if this is your interpretation of Hegel or a secondary authors that you've read of Hegel, and you've gone now from talking about what Nevid asked into femininity and things, and then it seemed like you were doubling back. And so, is National Geographic an example of kitsch? I mean, according to Hegel, if there was a neo-Hegelian who was looking at National Geographic saying, oh, you're what? If it's somebody else's religion, we can discount it and describe it as part of anthropology. I mean, I don't know where Hegel is in all this.
I guess my point is, this is actually like, these are my notes from like the procession of like, I stopped. Okay, so universal and singular, human and divine, polity and family, conscious and unconscious. These were the notes that I was writing as I was reading him. Like, and the only part that was brought in, I guess, from like outside sources would be the wise guys part, where wise guys are kind of jerks. But the part that I was bringing in was trying to make sense of, trying to describe my reading, I guess, my interpretation, what I think makes sense when I read the phrase, the feminine ridicules wisdom and elevates the spirit of familial individuality, though it still needs the polity to recognize it. That's the clay. That's what we have to work with. That's the earth. That's the earth that we need to use, I guess, or that we need to understand. We need to analyze and understand, And the phrase, the feminine ridicules wisdom and elevates the spirit of familial individuality, but still needs the polity to recognize it. It, like, I guess it's my position is that, like, it's worded a little weirdly. And I agree, like, I'm talking around these ideas, but I'm trying to, I guess, make them less technical and detached from things that make sense to me and experience. And as a part of that, at my point here, I guess, just to cut to my point, is that the relationship of the human and the divine law is that the divine law needs human law to recognize it. The divine law needs to be recognized by the state or by the human law in order to sustain itself and to be productive. Even though it sees itself as higher than the human law. It sees itself above human law, but necessarily needs human law to keep itself alive. Human law sees itself as above divine law, because divine law, according to Hegel at least, from the position of human law, is just disobedience. Divine law sees human law as violence, and human law sees divine law as a disobedience. So they're both like, you're weird, I don't get you. A pure arbiter of human law versus a pure arbiter of divine law, they'd be like, you are on a whole different wavelength than me, dude. I don't get it.
But it seems to me that it doesn't have to be rejection of either. I mean, Hegel can be recognizing the validity of both.
Well, yes, I'm saying that the point is, the human law, even though they have this antagonistic relationship of like, if I'm an agent of human law, my goal is to violate divine law. My goal.
Why? No. I take issue with that. Why? Look at how so much of positive law is based on earlier sensibilities from different religious traditions. I mean, why do you think Kant was spending so much time saying, hey, can we come up with a rational basis for a moral code? Because so much of it was based on Judeo, at least in the European context, Judeo-Christian beliefs. So let's get rid of that, not get rid of it. Let's not just base our what is metaphysics of morals?
Well, I wonder if part of what's going on here is and I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much meta, ethics back into, ancient Greece and so on. But part of what I wonder is if they're searching for a kind of ultimate ground for morality, like a transcendental ground for morality. And, and so the way I'm thinking of Antigone is you have this, I've said this in the Antigone seminar, but you have this very old, ancient sort of ethical tradition that's grounded in the family and grounded in this sort of divine character of all of reality. So all of reality has this divine character, and that these sort of ethical beliefs in that ancient view emerge from this ultimate ground, that's where they come from. And then you start getting these positive law that human beings invent. And Joseph challenged me on this, but I think I can show text for this, that Creon wants to say, no, our positive law is grounded in the divine too, so that he recognizes the need to call upon some authority so that human law is not simply arbitrary. And so, but then, by the end of Antigone, Creon seems to have conceded that no, you're right, this sort of ancient familial tradition is closer to this divine ground that gives structure and meaning to human existence. And so I'm kind of wondering if that's, and then even, like if you look at Kant, people like Nietzsche are going to claim that, yeah, sure, Kant tried to extract morality from this divine ground, but in fact, what he did was he created a rationalization. He basically, what Nietzsche would say is Kant basically took traditional Christian morality and then tried to invent a purely rational ground for it. And that's essentially what every ethics has done, for the last 2,000 years. And, Nietzsche called this the shadows of God, which sounds kind of like what's happening here. You have the shadows of God that are, although I guess for the ancient Greeks, they wouldn't have said they were shadows. They were reality.
They were reality. Yeah. And no, I love that phrase now, but I had never heard that before. I had shadows of God. I have to remember that. That's too perfect. But my sense of Hegel is, unless he was afraid he was going to get executed by whatever German kingdom he was living in, he maintained that he was a devout Lutheran throughout his whole life. So if he uses the word spirit with a capital S or even a small s, and he uses the term divine law, even if a concept of natural law, divine law, did originate with the ancient Greeks, I'm going to guess that he knew that he was using those terms that was being more than it was more than symbolism. He actually thought that there was some kind of reality to the spirit that he was referring to and divine law.
Yeah, no doubt.
Go ahead, Dylan.
Okay. No, I just found a little excerpt here that may help shed some light on it. I don't have too much to say other than this, but I think it's on skidmore.edu. I don't know necessarily which university that is, but it says here that Hegel expresses as follows the way in which the two aspects are inseparable. And then here I quote, neither of the two is alone self-complete. Human law as a living and active principle proceeds from the divine, the law holding on earth from that of the netherworld, the conscious and the unconscious, mediation from immediacy, and returns to whence it came. And he expresses, of course, the inseparability of the two divine and human law, meaning that they, I guess, together make some sort of a synthesis of a total law, some sort of law of totality or something along that world, or that they start in divine law and then human law will eventually lead us back around to the divine law, and that they help to bolster each other. I guess lending to both of them a level of significance and furthermore truth, I guess. But I don't know if that helps, but I just found that was interesting.
Thanks.
Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the relationship between Hegel's philosophy and traditional Christianity is a subject for great debate among Hegel's scholars. That some think he just basically redefined Christian theology in different terms. Other people think that he's basically an atheist. So, and I'm not. I mean, you know, like his big expressions of spirit are art, philosophy, and religion, not some ethereal, you know, divine being. And so it's not clear. I think I'm just saying it's a matter of debate. I don't think it's obvious.
Right. From what I understand as well, Feuerbach came off of Hegel, and I think this is you can kind of see where he got this from Hegel, but for Feuerbach, God is the essence of man, right? So kind of reversing the priority, you know, but and I can see that kind of a move being in Hegel, right? You know, and then Feuerbach running with it. So it is kind of a radical turn from traditional theology, but it is also Christian theology in its own right. You know what I mean? Somewhat like, was it? You know, there's that, you know, in the 20th century, there was Barth, and then I don't know if he was part of that thanatotheology movement, right? Death of God, right? Really tried to make this like a central pillar in a theology that God is dead, which leads me to, I think, one important point that that Hegel makes, and I felt like I understood it in this reading, is I think we're, you know, I think there's some agreement here that we can see how, you know, like the human law and the divine law kind of rely on each other, right? That the human law kind of relies on the divine law in order, you know, for its justification, and the divine law needs the human law for its, you know, its manifestation and its recognition. But there's also an antagonism as we see in Antigone, so that there is kind of this mutual dependency and mutual, but at the same time an antagonism. But one of the things that I like that Hegel put is that from the point of view of human law, divine law is all inner, right? And it made me think of, you know, it made me also think of kind of one reading of Nietzsche's Death of God is that God can no longer be the central pillar that guarantees morality, because we've reached a stage in history and theology where it's like, well, what God do you mean? You know what I mean? Like, we have so many different understandings of God that already makes it impossible to posit God as the central foundation for any morality. Like, you know, I mean, just a practical, you know, way of going about things. Some of the Bible thumpers who might come to your door and try to convert you, you know, you can ask, I mean, they'll just say God and God and God, but then I bet if you ask them, you know, two of them, enough questions, they'll soon enough find that they have different conceptions of God, right? And I think one of the things that Nietzsche and 19th century scholars really focused on is that we have so many different competing conceptions of God that now we've almost reached a point where God is a useless category, right? And I think that that's one of the things that feeds into the God is dead, not literally dead, not even metaphysically dead, just practically dead. Like, how can we even begin to center a culture, an ethics, a legal system on God when we can't even agree on what that means, you know? And in part, you know, following from Luther, and I don't think it was, you know, exclusive to Luther, but, you know, this emphasis on a personal relationship to God, I think kind of echoes what Hegel was, well, actually Luther was before Hegel. Hegel, you know, the divine law is always inner, right? But it's also, I mean, insofar it's a relationship to nature or the natural order, you know, the way the world is created, you know, as soon as we bring that into a public domain of discourse, then it starts to enter that area where divine law has to be recognized by human law in order to become manifest, right? But on its own, until it becomes recognized in human law, it is suspicious, right? It could be dangerous. It's dangerous, could lead to all sorts of mystifications, because if this is my inner revelation, this is my inner experience telling me what God says, well, how can you communicate? I mean, what does that mean to the rest of us, right? It only means something to the rest of us in the realm of public discourse. Once we've entered public discourse, we've now entered the world of human law, however inspired or justified by divine law it is, right? So anyway, I think, and I don't know if that made sense to you guys, but Hegel's comment on, from the point of view of human law, divine law is all inner. It made sense to me with that kind of a schematic.
I mean, the thing is too, I also partly go back to when Hegel was composing this work and what had already been happening in France. And so there was, you know, I'm forgetting, but the French government, just a few years after the revolution started, changed the calendar. So they had different days of the week, days of the months, basically nationalized the Catholic Church and created a cult of the supreme being, right? Which certainly wasn't traditional Catholicism. It wasn't necessarily Protestantism either. I mean, it was almost like an Enlightenment deist, trying to maintain this Christian sense, drained of a lot of the rituals and outer theology. So and remember when Hegel was standing there and Napoleon rode by, Hegel was saying, wow, I mean, here's this, I'm not doing justice to the quotation, world spirit just right on the source going by. All I'm saying is, with all the ferment in France, intellectually and governmentally, ideologically, Hegel could have used other terms than what he did. And since he chose to use them, and they do have some, I don't want to use the word commonsensical meanings, but if someone uses the word spirit, even if there's 15 definitions of it, I don't think we'll say, oh yeah, spirit, that's like a table. You know, I don't think we're going to go for the empirical when we hear the word spirit.
Nietzsche uses the word spirit a lot, and he's an atheist, a hard atheist.
But would you say that Hegel is a hard atheist?
I don't know. I mean, my sense from understanding Hegel very little is that Hegel probably believes there's some kind of divine aspect to reality, but that's about as far as I'm willing to go. And there are Hegel scholars today who would dispute that, and I'm not qualified to say.
I'm no Hegel scholar, but I've heard before from certain Hegel scholars, I've just done lectures, that they've said like a big point for Hegel, like a big weird spot in the story of Christ is the resurrection. And people say like, what would Hegel say about the resurrection? Would he say that Christ came back in some sort of metaphorical way, or that he was literally the son of a divine being that could resurrect itself in the form of materia? And I've heard just certain Hegel people say that at a certain point, I think for Hegel, it would be not so important whether or not he literally resurrected out of the ground, but that and this is all possible. It's possible that he really is, because I mean, he's an absolute idealist. He's not like a radical materialist or anything. He's not like a big, so not by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, he does believe in the scientific method. He's very wedded to science. But I agree, Nevitt, that he does seem to believe that there's some sort of divine aspect to experience. But I guess to me, it seems like he's always trying to position himself in this place where it's like, if you are a Christian, like a a fundamentalist Christian, a Christian that believes in the core tenets of Christianity as it is enunciated. Like, I believe in the resurrection. I believe that these events happened in this order as they were told. And I believe, belief, like Kierkegaardian straight up belief, faith, right? Or you can do something like, and this is where G.K. Chesterton is coming from. He was a conservative Catholic, though, so take what he says with a grain of salt. He was a very conservative Catholic. But he argues that it's possible to maintain a very authentic relationship to Christianity and Christendom, Christ, with a purely atheistic position or stance. And he says, and in fact, there's a really cool page, I'll post it in the Discord, where he says, Christianity, in fact, is the only religion that I can think of where God himself was an atheist, at least for a moment, at least for a second. Even God was. So if you're an atheist and you're looking for a God, what better one than the guy who's like, I don't even know. And his last words are, some of his very last thoughts are like, oh, geez, uh-oh. But I think that, my point is, I think that Hegel kind of, like I said with the dual speak thing, and this is to be fair, to be totally transparent, the dual speak thing that I'm talking about, where he's talking with double meanings, that's coming from a lot of like Rebecca Comey and Frank Ruda, like these neo-Hegelians that are saying these ideas, and that I'm finding to be at least believable. But my point is that it's like he can say the word spirit, and if you are a Christian, like a fundamentalist Christian that believes in God as like a mighty person.
I think you're misusing the word fundamentalist.
Oh, maybe so. Actually, yeah, maybe so. What would be a term then to say, I literally think that Jesus Christ of Nazareth turned water into wine and then came up out of the ether into a physical form, rather than I find the concepts that are present within the story to be valuable, like a metaphorical Christian versus a literalist interpretation? Is that like a...
Well, if you think Jesus was a great teacher and a moralist, and you do think there is a God that created the universe and then just sat back and has been resting for a while, that's basically deism. The deist as a general rule, and I'll defer to Ned with his reading, but everything I've read about, kind of like people like John Adams, and sometimes they're referred to in anthropological senses as nominal Christians. Yes, they recognize that there was this person named Jesus, but he was a rabbi, a teacher, a moral exemplar, but he was not the Son of God. He was completely human. And I would love to talk to you about this, but it's kind of getting a little bit further afield. My only point was, I don't know if some of you will remember some weeks ago when we were talking about earlier parts of this book, how Chase was angry at what he called Hegel's Lutheranism. I remember Chase being agitated about that. And I just think it's funny that after we're going through this book, that and no one said, "Oh, Chase, you're full of it." Where I don't see where you see Lutheranism at all. It was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I can understand why you're pissed off." And then now all of a sudden, Hegel is the precursor to Nietzsche. Is it that we are going to read all of these people and look, we all do it, but it sounds like, are we doing it from our perspective, so that if someone is an atheist, would they have more of a tendency to read atheism into Hegel? If one was a theist, would one have a tendency to read more theism into Hegel?
That may be true, but I think the fundamental problem is that it's just not clear in the text itself. Like Nietzsche says enough. I have met people that think that Nietzsche was not an atheist, but there's so much textual evidence that he was an atheist that it's hard to deny that. I think the problem with Hegel is that because of the way he writes and the things he says, the text can bear multiple interpretations based on the text itself. And so it may be true that atheists tend to gravitate toward an atheistic interpretation and theists toward a theistic interpretation. But I don't think it's that they're arbitrarily appropriating the text. I think this, the text itself is susceptible to multiple interpretations because of the way it's written.
I just muted myself. My dog was barking and I couldn't do anything about it. I would have been as noisy as him to shut him up. So, but no, thanks, Nevitt. I think that's well taken. And yeah, certainly I'm not gonna argue that Nietzsche is a traditional Lutheran. So.
I'm pretty sure he's not a traditional Lutheran. I don't know that anyone ever claimed that Hegel was a traditional Lutheran. I mean, I'm not, you know, like somebody who knows more correct me, but I think even though those people who believe that that Hegel was a Christian would argue that his idea of Christianity is fairly heterodox, at least compared to like traditional Catholic and Protestant theology.
Since, sorry to butt in right now, and I know that I was absent for most of it, but there was this really interesting idea that I heard you all discuss when I did sign on, about God being an unuseful term now when we were talking about Nietzsche. So I just wanted to return to that. And it's from what I gathered from what was said, there's this modern idea of everyone having different, you know, understandings of God. And now it's an unuseful term because I mean something completely different. But from what I know of the history of Christianity, that seems to be the case in its early roots as well, because the ecumenical councils, which really solidified the Catholic Church and the Orthodox, from which all these other splinterings happened, you know, didn't occur at the beginning. And you have all of these, you know, heretics, right? Like Marcion, who started the Gnostic movement, the Donatist in North Africa, right? But they all have these different conceptions of God. And even, yeah, Arianism, thank you. That's a really important one right there. But even at the beginning, you have this very splintered idea of God, you know, and then it seems that they made this artifice, and maybe Nietzsche has a lot to talk about there. Maybe that's the cleverness of Christianity, because I know he read The Gay Science earlier this year, and I think he mentioned that, where he complimented Christianity because the church came in and said, okay, this is how God is to be perceived. But then when we were talking more recently about interpretations, right, and how you read a thing, well, you were talking about Hegel, but when it comes to Bible tutelage, yeah, sure, you have someone like Spinoza who said, okay, let's use our reason because God gave us reason, and let's read through the book. It was written by humans, so it's totally fallible, and let's just see where it leads us. And of course, Spinoza is this pantheist, and his conception of God is this universal that's able to be reached, doesn't have particularity, right? So you wouldn't come with that same position where, oh, I have my idea of God and he has his idea and it's not the same. And that was something that Christians lashed out against. And of course, the Jews in the Netherlands excommunicated him. He changed his name, etc. So those were just some thoughts that I had that I wanted to bring out. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks.
You know, Eric, something he said, I'm just going to echo something that he said, and I've mentioned this before, something my advisor suggested, and again, this is very close to what something Eric said when he said God is dead, is that it's not just that we have different conceptions, it's that during the so-called Christian era, almost everyone accepted as an absolute fact that God exists and that God is the creator of the universe and that God cares about human beings and is involved in our lives. To say that there is no God during that era would be like saying the earth is flat today. Yeah, there are people who believe that. We know they're crazy. And to say that there is no God would have had the same kind of, you're just stupid if you don't believe in God and if you don't believe God is the creator. And so everyone just knew for a fact that there is a God, that God is creator, that God's involved in human affairs, and that God underwrites the moral order as well as the natural order. It was just obvious. And so, you know, what my advisor suggested is that God is dead. What that means is the concept of God has ceased to have that kind of absolute sway over Western culture. And there are, yeah, sure, there are people who believe in God, and there are people who don't believe in God. But even people, even the well, not maybe not the most dedicated believers, but even very dedicated Christians today feel that they're living in a world that questions the existence of God. And they feel and they understand in this deep kind of way that we're not really sure that our laws and our values have a kind of divine underwriting, which is why they have to fight for that. I mean, in the Christian era, no one had to fight for the idea that God was the ground of the moral order because everyone just knew it. Now you have to fight for that. And there are people who are going to fight you on it. And so the notion of God is dead, according to at least this interpretation of Nietzsche, is more that. The concept of God has ceased to be an unquestioned absolute truth that everyone just accepts. And that seems to me to be pretty much indisputable for most of the world today. Yeah, with regard to Aristotle, but I'm talking during the Christian era. So starting, I don't know when, a few hundred years after Christ, and then especially when Constantine became a Christian, I'm talking about Western Europe at least. That if you talk that kind of conception of God, whether you were Orthodox, whether you were Catholic, and then later whether you were Protestant or whatever, that for Western Europe anyway, the concept of God had that kind of power.
Yeah. Yeah, I apologize. I always see you as Barb. I don't remember your first name.
Jackson.
Jackson? Yeah, Jackson. Yeah, the idea of the unmoved mover, that phrase also is, again, connected to deism. And then a lot of Europeans were really shocked at the earthquake of Lisbon. Was that 1755? And for a lot of European intellectuals, that was such a devastating event. And it's like, yeah, but the people of Lisbon were just walking around, and then all of a sudden you have this horrible, horrific earthquake that just wiped out the capital city, killed thousands upon thousands of people. They were all sinful and they needed to die that way. And so there was a real shaking of European Christian faith, and at least on the part of some people, because of that earthquake. It seemed arbitrary. It seemed mean-spirited. It seemed to have no meaning. And if God was interfering, or think of another verb, intervening in the affairs of human beings, why would that kind of God do that to Lisbon? Lisbon, no matter its fault, was not Sodom and Gomorrah, so what's going on here? And so for a lot of people, they just went to atheism.
And the Holocaust in the 20th century
Exactly
had the same, existentialism was kind of born out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. How can you believe that there's a God after this?
Yeah.
Which I'll just, a little personal note here, that the problem of endemic evil in the world and these sorts of things is what ultimately broke my faith. So anyway.
Well, how do you, Nevitt, beg your pardon for me saying I understand that, because we all go through our own personal, growth and experiences and trying to make sense of the world. But that was an abomination. How could something like the Holocaust happen and there be any kind of God remotely interested in human beings?
That's exactly the thought, the kind of process that I say broke my faith.
Yeah.
And then looking at, as Hegel puts it, the slaughter bench of history. Like you say, you mentioned the natural events like Lisbon, but the earthquake, but then you just look at the history. If you think about what percentage of the human race has been born, lived an absolutely horrible life, and then died. by far the majority of the human race, billions and billions of people. To me, if that's something, I mean, I'm sorry, Joseph and Jackson, but that makes God a moral monster. If that's the kind of world that God built, then that makes God into an absolute moral monster. And I struggled with that for decades, and I got so angry, I finally just had to leave because I was living in a constant state of anger and despair. Every time I would walk into a church or sing a hymn, I would go into a rage. You know, I would read these hymns, it's like, all this is a bunch of bullshit. All these hymns are a bunch of lies. And so I'm sorry, I just, you know, that whole problem is what finally just broke me. I tried to maintain a faith and tried to think my way through it for 30 years, 40 years, and finally failed. So I don't call myself a hardcore atheist because there are some days when I have some vague sense that there might be a divine presence and things. And there's alternate theologies like process theology and things of that sort that have a different conception of God that can allow for this kind of problem of evil. But ultimately, the severity of the problem of evil is what ejected me from traditional Christianity. I just can't do it anymore.
No reason to apologize, I think, right? Because as you said, this is something you've thought of, and it's still something I'm thinking of. You know, I'm not nice and comfy, and because you have your good point, I'm going to be upset, you know? So that's all.
Yeah, Nevit, you've really created a wonderful environment here in these seminars on Zoom to be just very honest about what we were thinking and feeling. And so, yeah.
Yeah, please never apologize. I very, at least for
Yeah,
my part,
no.
I edify greatly from participation in this, and I learn more about myself, I think personally, by hearing so many different worldviews. So I love the genuineness in this group. I love the honesty, and I love the different worldviews it presents. It helps me grow as a person. So please never apologize for that.
And one reason I feel safe in saying things like that here is because you guys are all mature enough to hear what I say and think in your minds, what a load of bullshit. Whereas, you know, I don't say this kind of thing to a room full of 18-year-olds, for example.
Yeah, right.
You know, because I'm sensitive to people who are in the midst of crises of faith, and I don't want to just push them off a cliff. You know what I mean? And so you know, you guys are all mature enough emotionally and psychologically and so on that I can say stuff like that. You guys can go, well, that's a good point, or you can go, eh. So
I just want to make sure that I lay down total transparency. I am not mature in any way. I just want to make sure we said that. I am not mature. So okay, that's all.
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean.
Flattered you say that, yeah.
I have a sense of humor of a 13-year-old boy, as I say.
Yeah,
so.
me too.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one thing. Well, didn't Kierkegaard even say that every good Christian should doubt on a daily basis the existence of God himself? So, I mean, even you know, the good Christians are supposed to have these doubts from a Kierkegaardian view. I think anybody who looks into it in depth should come across these, should do that, should question it in that way. So,
yeah, I mean, I think what
I completely agree with your skepticism. Yeah,
I think what he would say to
Go
me
ahead.
is, yeah, good point, but you need to take the leap of faith anyway, because your life isn't going to have any meaning or value unless you do that. So, and I have never had the opportunity, but I would like to teach a course on Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, because they're in a kind of the same place with regard to skepticism, but they break in completely opposite directions. And I think that's very interesting to see two people honestly struggling with exactly the same problem and breaking in opposite directions. I think that's very instructive. And they're both, considered fathers of existentialism. So anyway, any final, go ahead. Does someone have a comment?
I gotta go. That's all. Thank you
Okay.
all. See you Monday. Bye.
I'm gonna have to catch up on the YouTube video because the debacle. Sorry for missing most of it, but yay kids. So I'm just happy he's safe. So sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Well, as you've noticed, this is a very informal group, so
I appreciate that. Yeah.
you can come and go as you need to. So
Yeah, I missed so much, and I want to go back and hear what you guys said. So I'll watch it on the rebroadcast.
okay.
As always,
So-
guys, it was a pleasure.
Okay. See you guys Monday, hopefully, or Friday. Bye-bye.
I'll be safe.
You too.